Well, hello there everyone. uxwbill here with you once again on an absolutely beautiful, if unfortunately rather windy, fall day. This is Sunday, September 21st, 2014, and this particular video is going to talk about a couple of different things. It's been a while since I've made a video featuring any part of the great outdoors, but as I said, there are plenty of things that we've been up to lately. And one of those things has been some rather major remodeling efforts. After we got the wall on the front porch all fixed up, we turned our attention to some other parts of the house, specifically this area right here, which was generally not all that pretty any longer, and it was also quite rotten. So we hired a carpenter to fix this up, and he and my dad both worked on this for a period of a day, and they put it all back together. They took out some rotten boards, they replaced this outer material, also cleaned up the telephone wiring a little bit, removed an abandoned telephone cable, and rerouted the existing one much more neatly than it had been done before. They also did some work on the old garage building. We had a problem with a rotten board up here. They took that rotten board out and replaced it with a newer one, and then they went ahead and put some metal in place to try and protect the board from incursion by the elements in future. As you can see, this is right on the edge of the roof here. And you'll notice there's something missing from this side of the garage. Years and years ago, there was a gutter here, and that's the next big project that's going to be starting soon, because the gutters on this house have been the same for as long as we've lived here, and that's been more than 20 years now. And they are really starting to show their age. They weren't new when we moved in here, and they haven't gotten any better since then. One of the most niggling problems that we've had is this particular area up here. You can see right now there's a little plant growing out of it, maybe even a tree of some kind. There's also a bird nest in there. The birds have been absolutely horrible about that. In fact, the previous owner of this house actually put up some screening mesh around that area and hung a rubber snake from it to try and keep the birds out. It didn't work. The other fun little thing that this guttering has done in the past is to drip right on the primary steps here at the house, and that's really annoying when you're trying to walk in the door. My mother has done some major remodeling on the porch. I guess we'll go ahead and walk in here and take a look at it. This was in need of some major remodeling. The paint on these walls was incredibly tired, and so too was the paint on the ceiling. So she's really cleaned this up, made it look pretty nice. She did all of this herself. She even painted those cabinets. And we have a little saying up there that, while I could not translate that for you directly, I believe it says something to the effect of, "Bidden or unbidden, God is always present." So she went ahead and did that work, did some stenciling around it and those kind of things, and hung up some new pieces of wall art as well. So we've been quite busy on the home renovation front. We're going to be busier still, because the lower floor bathroom in this house, I've never shown it to you, and there's a reason for that. Well, not the least of which that the bathroom is hardly the most photogenic room in anyone's house. But the lower floor bathroom in this house is the only room in this house that I would say truly qualifies as a dump. I think you just saw the need for new guttering on this house obviated. Look at what a mess that is. So we've got a guttering contractor that's supposed to be here anytime now. That's just amazing. I start making a video about these renovations, and this guttering obliges my purpose, this downspout obliges my purpose by falling off. That's just absolutely lovely. Those of you who are wondering, Furhead's got his Jeep entirely fixed now. It's got a new alternator in it. They solved the problem with the noise the transmission was making. It was just an issue with a dust shield, I'm sorry. Unfortunately, he did some body damage to this Jeep, because this was quite an arduous process, and there were times when Furhead's confidence slipped more than a little, and one day, unfortunately, he lost his temper. He took a hammer to this, and he took a hammer to the driver's side door as well. We got him stopped before he did anything truly regrettable, but as you can see, he's at least started to make some repairs on this, painted over the bare metal, so at least rust won't be a huge problem for this thing, and at some point I'm sure he'll finish pounding the rest of this out and leveling it and filling it in and all that good stuff. But the Jeep is 100% functional again, and I think Furhead is pretty elated to have finally reached that particular point. This Mercury Grand Marquis that's sitting here, this is not the Key Keepers. This is my grandfather's car. It's just over here temporarily because my dad took him to church today. This is the Key Keeper's car, and there's my mother's Park Avenue. And I'm getting closer to the subject of today's video. But I'm not there quite yet. We've unfortunately had a rash of some vandalism around these parts. There was a tire slashing marathon that went pretty much from one end of town to the other. No word on who did it, and I don't think anybody's been apprehended. We were thankfully spared from this. I don't want to look a gift horse in the mouth or jinx myself by saying anything about it, but if you want my honest opinion, and I hope you'll forgive the wind noise, I think that right there probably had an awful lot to do with it. Even though in recent times the power was off at the Roach Palace, I actually turned it back on, so those cameras are recording again. And Operation Panopticon has been expanded. I now have some cameras that are mounted to the garage. Now these are just being auditioned, so they're not permanent yet. You'll notice I have a very high-tech strip of masking tape up there. But I'm not too worried about that, or someone bothering it, because I figure if they do, I'm going to have a pretty good view of them walking up to it and things like that. I actually found a DVR and camera set on eBay for right around $100 with express shipping included, coming out of Hong Kong, China, somewhere in there. And you know what they say about Chinese quality, but this system doesn't seem too bad. I'd say the cameras are better than the DVR by a long shot, but they both seem to be pretty serviceable. And the DVR itself is a little appliance with built-in network functionality. Basically, the only thing you have to do is bring your own hard drive. So I stuck a 2 terabyte Western Digital purple surveillance series hard drive in it, and so far this thing's doing all right. These cameras, being as cheap as they are, they don't have an infrared light filter. Some of the better security cameras that I have, the ones that are mounted to the outside of the Roach Palace do, so during the day their colors look normal. These things look a bit strange even at the best of times, but their night vision capability seems excellent. However, that too is not the primary subject of this video. The primary subject of this video probably wouldn't be worth a video all its own, so I'm just sticking a bunch of stuff together in here in the hopes of making a video that is interesting, perhaps even exciting, and hopefully worth your viewing time. In order to get to the main subject of the video, I have to go ahead and open the garage door. Look in on a sleeping wagon. Those of you in the viewing audience who have been watching my videos for at least the past year or so may very well be aware of what particular time and event was growing near. That's right, it was time for me to make my yearly adventure out to the Peoria, Illinois Superfest Hamfest. Now, there are probably a few folks in the viewing audience who will happen to ask, and to answer your question, no, I am not personally a ham radio operator, nor do I have a license to do so. However, some of my very good friends are ham radio operators, and they introduced me to the Peoria Superfest back around the year 2000 or thereabouts, and I have been in attendance ever since. My dad, although he does not operate a ham radio, is also a licensed ham radio operator. Now, I have been encouraged over the years to pick up the microphone and get myself a radio, but it's just something that I've never done, primarily because I have far too many hobbies as it is. But there's far from just ham radios at a Hamfest. You will also find electronic junk of every category imaginable, which is one of my very favorite things to go off in search for. You will also find computers, and of course my most favorite thing of all is to find any excuse at all in order to drive the wagon. And I've got to say that the wagon did pretty well this year. Got 24 miles to the gallon, driving at 75 miles an hour on the open highway. And there's only one minor problem with the wagon that has sprung up as of late. Well, there are two minor problems. When the engine is hot, sometimes when you restart it, it gets temperamental about wanting to start up again. It will start, it will fire right off, but sometimes after that the idle will become extremely lumpy, and it will have a great deal of trouble staying running. It doesn't always do it when it's hot, and I have not yet tried to troubleshoot what exactly the problem is, but I do strongly believe that all of the ignition system parts on this car are factory original, which means they are now 21 years old at least. Look at this, we have a spider dropping in to visit. Digression! Go away. Anyway, I have purchased a complete set of ignition system parts, positive crankcase ventilation valve, spark plugs, distributor cap and rotor, plug wires, the whole 9 yards. Just need to get those installed sometime. But the other problem that this wagon has in more recent times, and it's more noticeable when it's cold, which makes me think it might be a bad front tire or something along those lines, I have noticed a certain shimmy in the steering wheel, especially at lower speeds. It seems to be the most pronounced around 40 miles an hour. It practically goes away when you're traveling at full highway speed. Starts to fade around the area of 60 miles an hour, and like I said, it does get better as the car it changes, gets better, and doesn't shimmy as badly when the car is warmed up. And boy, that was kind of a bungling of my usually very confident phrasing of things in videos. But oh well, this is as it happens, folks. I am not reshooting this. Getting back to the Hamfest, however, one of the things that I go in search for is computers. And this year, I have to say that there were a lot more buyers and sellers around. But some of the old standbys that had been there in the past, in particular the individual from who I bought the Optiplex 760 computers, I think that was last year, was not there this year. And I was very, very surprised and even kind of disappointed, because their presence was a lot of the reason why I continued to attend this year. I like to look through their pile of stuff that they claim not to work, buy it for a couple pennies on the dollar, get it home and fiddle around with it. Hey, it's something to do, it passes the time. But I did find a few interesting things. The first thing that I found, well, not quite the first thing, but pretty close to, that I actually paid real money for, was this AMD. It's marked as a 2500, which tells me that it is probably an Athlon XP machine. Has a gigabyte of memory in it, a 30 gigabyte hard drive, 32-bit only, of course, and claims to be running Linux Mint 17. I did not pay $30 for this. I would not have paid $30 for this. I bought it from an older man, and I made him an offer. I offered him $15 for it, and he said, well, I really wanted $30, but I don't want to take it home, so $15 it is. And I ended up with it. I got the manual with it. I got the power cord still stuck into the power supply. I actually had a system like this at my former workplace a number of years ago in this same Antec case, only it was a black version of the case. You know what they say about black computers being faster, right? Well, I think gray ones are kind of a mix of the best of both worlds, you know? They've still got some decent speed advantage, but their neutral coloring better lets them blend into any decor. This is actually kind of a nice case. The one that I had actually had a bigger fan in the back of it. Surprisingly, despite the nice nature of this case and its decent quality, it looks like whoever put it together cheaped out on the power supply. This looks like one of those no-name ATX power supplies that's probably honestly specified for 250 watts, but in all likelihood weighs next to nothing and is probably rated at a much greater wattage. We'll find out. Go ahead and pop the cover off this. I did steal a quick look at it. That was smooth. I sure hope I can get that out of there without an advanced engineering degree or something. I should have figured that would happen. It's about my luck. I did take a look at this just to make sure that there was nothing patently wrong with it, like bloated capacitors or anything along those lines, but AC line power was not readily accessible, so I have to take the seller's word for it that it actually did work. But even if it doesn't, 15 bucks is not a whole lot of money to be out, and of course my running mantra is anything is worth 20 bucks. Now, in order to pop this open, it does take a little diddling around. The seller clearly demonstrated that the side panel on this case does not come off particularly easily, which suggests to me that maybe at some point in its life it has been tweaked or abused in some fashion. Fortunately, we have that universally handy tool known as a butter knife from the kitchen. These things are great for changing, for opening UPS battery access doors and also opening recalcitrant. That's your word for the day. Computer cases. And see, just turned it into child's play. I just figured something out here. You'd think I'd be a little more aware of this, being as I've owned this car for about 2 years now. But if this will clear and it's not binding up on that screw, this tailgate opens in both directions, and as the French say, viola. It's a line from the Red Green Show. I know it's not actually pronounced that way. Let's go ahead and open that in the tailgate mode once again. Sometimes that thing is very, very handy. Let's see what we've got in here. Well, the first sign of some cost cutting. Obviously, the only thing that they had a significant amount of money in the budget for was the case, is the presence of what some would call a PC Chips motherboard. Now, PC Chips, as they're actually known, is one of those slightly shady companies. Slightly shady is probably giving them a little too much credit. They were the famous makers of 486 motherboards back in the day with totally fake cache chips and a BIOS that was modified to report the message that the cache was accounted for and working. But I do have to give good old PC Chips a little bit of credit, because every one of their products that I have ever come across, I've never bought any new because I usually aim a bit higher in the marketplace than that, has worked reliably. So I really don't think there's anything wrong with that. Plus, check this out. This board is an absolutely racy red color, and you know the only thing that's faster than a black cased computer or black computer boards are red ones. In fact, this thing might be so doggone fast with that red motherboard and that neon orange AGP slot and the equally orange heatsink on the North Bridge that it might just give a Core i7 machine a run for its money if that machine's in a beige case. Now put your keyboards down. Those of you who didn't get the joke, I'm just goofing around here. Don't come after me. I know this thing is not as fast as a Core i7. It's not even in the same league, but it should be a pretty useful little system. We'll go ahead and power it up here in just a little bit and see if it actually happens to work, but I cannot imagine any reason why it would not. It is, like most real computers of the time, equipped with a floppy drive. We have one of those parallel ATA Western Digital drives, a WD-300, from a time when those drives began life operating quietly and then later turned into a screamer of some kind. We have NVIDIA graphics. I'm not actually sure what level of GeForce graphics card that is. And this system is based, I'm sure I'll get lots of fan mail for this, on an SIS chipset. But you know what? There was a time when SIS absolutely ruled the chipset market back in the day with the 496, 497, 486 chipset. And I personally, again, have had very, very little trouble with SIS chipsets over time. But I do know that experiences can differ. So let's go ahead and put this thing aside for the time being. I'm not going to try to wrestle the front panel back onto it, the side panel onto it just yet. We'll move to some other things that I found at the Hamfest. Here's one right now. I bought this from my very, very good friend, Well Don't Do That. You can look up his channel by checking out the video description on this particular video if you're interested in seeing some of his work. I bought some computer equipment from him recently that there might be videos about in the future, but one thing that I did not know he was going to sell, and in fact I was very surprised to see him selling it, was this time machine clock. Now I'm sure that many of you out there have probably seen these clocks. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the mechanism, you can pause the video right now and look at it and get a feel for how it is designed to work. Of course, there were a couple other interesting finds as well, and to show you those, go ahead and pop open the secret smuggling compartment here at the back of the station wagon. Go ahead and show you what I've got going on here. Someone should probably call the police on me. You know why? Because there are two things here that I absolutely stole, and no, I don't feel the first bit repentant about either one of them. Over here on the left, we have an IBM Model M keyboard, the genuine article from August 27th of 1991, part number 1391401. This is actually the version that has the 5-pin DIN style AT keyboard connector on it, but it is of course effortlessly adapted using a very inexpensive adapter to a computer that has PS2 ports. And if you feel the need to go further than that, reach into my pocket here, show you another thing I found. Several USB to PS2 adapters for those of you who are there's $1, who are burdened with weenie modern computers. These USB to PS2 adapters cost me $1 a piece, and they actually do seem to work. They did not just throw the computer into halt and catch fire mode when I plugged them in. Whether or not they will actually work with an IBM Model M keyboard remains to be seen. But I found this keyboard from the same man that I bought the computer in the Antec case from. He had a box full of stuff that was marked free. I could not believe it. That's right, folks. A free IBM Model M keyboard, complete with some bonus sticky material. I hope that that is some sort of sticky tack or blue tack style material, but I would not be surprised if it might not be chewing gum. This keyboard does need a bit of a cleaning, and I haven't actually tested it yet, but what the hey, it's a Model M. I'm practically certain it works. The real coup here, the real thing that I really pulled off, and I'm very proud of myself, there was a guy at the Hamfest that was selling various beat up and derelict server cases that he had hauled in on a big old cargo trailer, as well as thoroughly dusty and beaten down industrial control panels and things like that. In amongst all the things that he had sitting on that trailer, I caught this out of the corner of my eye. And for those of you who are familiar with IBM Model M keyboards, this thing needs no introduction. This is one of the holy grails of the Model M keyboard family, if you can find one. And lately, prices for these things have been absolutely through the roof on eBay. In fact, I bought one a number of years ago from V Westlife and actually paid quite handsomely for it back in the day. But luckily, he threw in a couple things as a value-added bonus. So, what did I pay for this thing? How about $2? Oh, the guy who was selling it walked up to the display, walked up to his trailer, if you could call it that, and I said to him, you know, what would you want for that keyboard? And he said, oh, a couple of bucks. And I said, define a couple. And he said, how about two? I handed over the cash, and I got the heck out of there before anybody knew what had happened, because these things are worth approximately their weight in gold. And again, I don't know if this one works, but it's a Model M. Of course it's going to work, almost certainly. Found a couple other treasures as well, all in highly electrostatic handling regulation compliant packaging. Got a couple of video cards here. This is a Matrox AGP card of some kind or another. Not sure exactly which one. Then we have a couple of ATI cards right here, featuring television tuners and video inputs as well as television outputs. This one is based on the ATI Rage Theater chip. This one I do not see a similar chip on it. I do not know how old these are. I am sure that they are not brand new, but I'll bet that they work just fine. There's actually two Rage Theater. No, wait a minute. I'm confusing this one with that one. The Rage Theater chip on this one is actually mounted on the back. And here's something interesting. Take a look at what that says. Non-qualification sample. Not sure what all that exactly means, but apparently this was a development version of the board. Made in Canada. You wouldn't see that anymore. Not for resale. Date February 5th of 2002. So it'll be interesting to see what that does when we pop it into a computer. This is just an NVIDIA card, I would guess. Just taking a wild guess here. This is out of a Dell machine, I can tell you that much. I would guess GeForce 6150, 6200, somewhere in there. I have to plug it into a machine and see what it does. A Sound Blaster Live 5.1 that I'm hoping to use and hoping is supported by the KX driver project. I have at least one board that would run with those drivers, but I've never actually used them, and this board cost me $1. So, as did all the rest of these. So hopefully they'll come in handy for something. Another entry from the free bin that unfortunately appears to have suffered an indignity here. I hope I can fix that. This was a Netgear FA410TX fast Ethernet adapter for PCM CIA, not card bus. Important distinction that a lot of card manufacturers do not get right, but as you can see, we've definitely had a miniature disaster here. Possibly more than that. I will have to see if I can somehow put that right, but that's not good. Oh, this is the documentation for the PC Cheaps system board, socket A, a Linux Mint disk, a floppy drive in shrink wrap, supposedly refurbished, but I'd be surprised if it was ever used. You know, you can always use a floppy drive. And then an early Texas Instruments electronic calculator with that red LED display that you love so much. Mine for the princely sum of $1. I think there's probably a dead battery in here that I need to go ahead and remove. And there you can see the model number. And as previously stated, this is a member of the TI DataMath series of calculators, which actually did encompass some more advanced machines than this one. This is just a simple 4-function machine, and as you can see on the back, it gives you some instructions as to how to use it. It also says that the built-in battery gives 4 to 6 hours of portable operation, full recharge in 10 hours. Okay, so this thing actually has a rechargeable battery of some kind in it that's probably no good at this point. So a little more complicated than I was hoping for, but still a pretty neat piece. Go ahead and see what else I've got in here. Got a battery tender that I actually purchased from Well Don't Do That's father. He had used this thing in his basement for many years to keep a deep cycle battery as part of a backup lighting system running, and has apparently replaced it with something newer. But I figured this might be just the ticket for keeping the battery up in a vehicle such as this station wagon that's not going to see a whole heck of a lot of use during the winter months. Not that I can say that the wagon has really had a problem with keeping its battery up when it's not being actively used in the winter. The goodies continue right after this. Okay, I'm back. I had some stuff that I had to take care of before I could get around to discussing the rest of the goodies that I happened to pick up. This video has certainly run on for quite a while now. I'm sure that some of you are probably getting a little bit put out with all of my rambling, but luckily the end of the treasures is rapidly approaching. I'm actually surprised it's taken me as long as it has to discuss all of this stuff, because as I said, even though there were a lot of buyers and sellers there just wasn't a lot of stuff that I actually wanted to buy this year. There just wasn't a lot of stuff that happened to catch my fancy. And there were some things that did, but the people who were selling them had priced them such that they were apparently rather more inclined to keep them. Some of the best stuff that I found didn't cost me a thing. There was an electronics recycling company that had set up various bins for the recycling and collection of unwanted electronics equipment from the Hamfest, of which I'm sure there's quite a bit. That same company had actually set up shop on the grounds of the Hamfest and was selling stuff that I can only guess that they had reclaimed from their recycling operations elsewhere. They had a lot of 1970s hi-fi gear, both high and low end, and utterly forgettable. Their prices, unfortunately, were completely out to lunch. They had an Apple II Plus or an Apple IIe computer with a color monitor attached to it, good shape, and it was operating, but those are not worth $500. No way, no how, especially for one that didn't have any sort of particularly unique or interesting expansion cards in it. Those things are just way too common to even fathom paying that kind of money for. But the stuff out of the recycle bins, they weren't very well guarded. So here's one of the first treasures I found in a Hewlett-Packard computer that someone had dumped in there and stripped of most its internals, but not everything. This is a very nice little processor cooler. I did get the retention brackets for this. Got a nice little Foxconn fan on one end of it there. Underneath that, I found the microprocessor itself, which is mixed in with this bag of replacement meter leads from Beckman Industrial. Those might be handy for any of the various multimeters I have. Someone had thrown these in the recycling bin, even though I think they were brand new. And like I said, the Pentium 4 Socket 478 processor from the Hewlett-Packard computer is in there. Unfortunately, it's got heatsink paste on it, and that obscures the markings on it, so I don't know what that was. I also found in the recycling bin this Comair Rotron box that actually has a Dayton Electric little blower fan in it, a little AC-powered blower fan, intended for use with 115 volts at 50 or 60 cycles per second. I don't think that this is the original blower that was in this box, although it certainly could have been. It's very heavy. This frame is made of cast metal. Unfortunately, it seems that someone cut the wiring off of it. So I really don't know if this little motor actually happens to be any good or not. But one of these days I'll have to power that up and see if anything useful can be done with it, because that's quite a nice little blower, really. What else have we got? In the other collection of recycled things, I found this Dell Dimension 2400 personal computer. Now, the Dell Dimension 2400 was a low-end machine to start with, and it's getting to the point where a lot of software these days does not run particularly well on these, but what the heck, I went ahead and picked it up anyway, just because I've always liked these machines and the case that they come in. And with a little bit of expansion, the Dell Dimension 2400 is definitely not a bad little machine. Unfortunately, this thing had suffered some indignities at the hands of its previous owner, some of which were no doubt inflicted upon it by the recyclers. Fortunately, those indignities do not include bad capacitors. They are all in good shape and all are accounted for. This machine says it has a full-fledged Pentium 4 processor. Somebody stripped the hard drive. I've never seen anything quite like that. You know, I've seen hard drives that get smashed. I've seen hard drives that get crushed. I've seen hard drives shot with guns. I never saw anything quite like this. Somebody literally pried it apart with a screwdriver, pried all the platters and the head stack out of it. Fortunately, they left me the drive mounting cage, which is a Dell-specific item, and the screws are even rattling around in this computer somewhere. Now, I think that this thing will probably operate perfectly, but I did notice something when I pulled it out of the station wagon just now. And that's the fact that it probably landed, well, let's just say exceptionally firmly in the recycling bin. You can see that the I/O shield here on the motherboard has been splayed out pretty badly, so much so that the screw, the retention fastener for screws going into the serial port, has been pushed flush with the I/O shield. So I might have to pop the board out of this machine. But I think when we test this one, go ahead and test this too. And finally, on to the last couple of finds, and I do mean couple quite literally. Power supply, an ATX type, manufactured by Hi-Pro, model number HP-D2537F3R. This is a 250 watt rated power supply. Probably good for a little bit more than that, because I found that Hi-Pro usually rates these things pretty conservatively, especially for how well they're made. No bloated capacitors of any kind in it, at least not that I can see. And if they're going to bloat, it's usually the ones on the output side that will do so. I'm thinking this might end up being a replacement power supply for the no-name job that's in the Antec machine. Cost me a whopping 50 cents. And then something that you will not often see anymore, an AT style power supply. I have no idea what this would have originally come out of. It is unique in the fact that it does not have the conventional big red switch on the side. It actually has a much smaller black switch on the back, and unfortunately it does appear that it has been in a damp area or that it has been wet at some point in its life. So I want to power this one up with a fair bit of caution, probably not until after I've inspected the internals to look for any gross defects, because you can't see very much through the fan openings on this and the finely punched holes on the side. So just have to go ahead and pop that apart. Luckily, there's nothing too difficult about doing that, because these are not any sort of security screws. There actually is one more thing that I purchased, but I went ahead and took it indoors, and that's a little Heathkit digital clock, an early example with a vacuum fluorescent display. Who knows? It's not very exciting, it's pretty plain, but I just might make a video about it in future. Anyway, that rounds out the Hamfest finds. Now I'm back here in the garage looking at the other end of the security camera system that I've recently, albeit temporarily, installed. This will certainly be neatened up when I find the final resting place for the recorder itself, as well as all of the finished vantage points for the various cameras. But right now there's wires and cabling everywhere, because like I say, it's just being temporarily installed for the purposes of auditioning the camera vantage points as well as the reliability of the system. We'll go ahead and turn on this old monitor here. This is a nothing to write home about, very well used LG StudioWorks 700S CRT monitor. I mean, it has had a lot of use and wear over the years, but hey, it still works and it's paid for, and it just so happened to be out here in the garage, and it also met the requirements for the video output on this DVR system. This recorder actually has hookups on the back for not only a conventional VGA monitor, but also a television set. And if you use a VGA monitor with it, it has to be capable of supporting either 1024 by 768 or 800 by 600 resolutions. So if you have a really old clunker monitor somewhere that's otherwise gathering dust, you may not be able to use it with this thing. Go ahead and take a look at the video output here. You can see it's overlooking the driveway. Although I have just 2 cameras hooked up right now, the system actually did come with a total of 4. And these don't seem too terribly badly made for what they are. Like I say, the cameras are the best part of the system. The DVR leaves a fair bit to the imagination, unfortunately. The DVR's biggest failings are twofold. First of all, the documentation for it was not written by someone with even a vaguely competent grasp of the English language. So as far as figuring out all this thing's functionality, I've had to go down a lot of blind alleys and do some random experimentation, because the instruction manual that came with it, while it tries to be thorough, it is unfortunately absolutely incomprehensible. The system also has an Ethernet interface, like a lot of DVR things these days do. Unfortunately, you would think in this day and age of portable software that this thing would use an approach that was open to more browsers and computing platforms than just Internet Explorer and ActiveX. Unfortunately, like all the other DVR solutions that I have ever seen, it is completely dependent on a browser that supports ActiveX, which pretty much limits you to either virtualizing or emulating Microsoft Windows and the Internet Explorer browser, which is unfortunate. The CD that came with this thing and the auction listing itself hint that other operating systems are supported, but they are only supported through means of alternative application software, and at least in the copy of the little disc that I received with this thing, it appears that the software for the Macintosh and iPhone platforms, I don't know about the Android support, would be corrupt. For the most part, though, this system seems pretty well built. The DVR itself claims to be running an embedded Linux distribution of some kind, though I've seen no offer for the source code in the name of compliance with the general public license. It comes with this cheap little optical mouse that allows you to control the system's various functions. There's also an infrared remote control that's bundled in the box. And like I say, the cameras in the DVR seem pretty well built, but the instructions and the network functionality do seem to let it down. You bring your own hard drive with this system. As previously mentioned, I installed a WD Western Digital 2 terabyte purple surveillance grade drive, which is probably grossly underutilized in a system such as this, because Western Digital touts those drives as having support for high definition surveillance capture from multiple feeds, and this is just barely standard definition. It's actually rather less than that. I think this thing is recording CIF format video. You can look up the technical details of that online to read all about it, because it'll probably do a better job of explaining it than I can here in the video. But overall, this thing's not too bad. It doesn't actually run all that hot to the touch, even though there's a hard drive in here and no fan to keep it cool. It uses a highly integrated system on chip. The only outboard components are a Connexent television encoder and decoder, an audio capture device, which is essentially unused, and then some RAM chips and an IC Plus 10100 wired Ethernet solution. I've seen some evidence that suggests a wireless version of the same might exist or was at least considered, but I've not actually seen any physical evidence of that. The power supplies that came with this unit, and this one is just wedged up here to keep it from falling behind the freezer, are unfortunately very lightweight and cheap. They probably have the nasty side effect of spraying the AM and shortwave radio bands or any radio transmissions using amplitude modulation with all manner of needless interference. I would be extraordinarily surprised to find that these units actually had any kind of proper filtering in them, which is certainly unfortunate. Anyway, that's about all I can think of to say about this thing. It does seem to do a pretty credible job. The faded, washed out colors here on the monitor are actually something of a byproduct of the monitor's age and wear, although you can see the focus is actually still pretty good on it. It also has to do with the fact that the cameras, as previously mentioned, do not have any sort of an infrared blocking filter, because it would probably raise the cost of the units, since it has to be switched out when they switch to their night vision IR assisted mode. So you get rather washed out colors during the day, but the colors do exist, as you might be able to see there on the back of the neighbor's 56 Ford pickup, as well as the red roof of their shed, and even some of Ruby, my mother's 2002 Buick Park Avenue's body color comes through. But it's definitely kind of funny looking, but you know, that's okay, because you don't need pinpoint accurate color for most uses of a security system, and if you do, you're probably not looking to buy a cheap little system like this anyway. Well, that certainly deteriorated rather quickly. What should have been an easily and quickly completed task of removing a motherboard from this computer went well up until I hit a certain complication, and unfortunately it was a rather major complication at that. You see, Dell chose to fasten this motherboard to the case like most computer manufacturers or assemblers do. They used screws in all the usual places for a mini ATX board such as this, but they made a rather curious design decision in the way that they chose to mount the CPU's cooling heatsink to the motherboard. Rather than simply using some kind of a clip or even an X-plate on the back of the board, they actually chose to put a plastic retention bracket in place here and then run screws through it, not to an X-plate style assembly, but actually to the other side of the case. I don't know why they chose to do this, if it had something to do with holding the computer's emissions down or providing more stable ground planes for the processor, or just because someone at the Dell Engineering Laboratory was feeling particularly contrary that day, possibly because they hadn't had their morning coffee yet. Now, I know that some of you in the viewing audience will question the wisdom of my playing around with this old computer junk, as well as the worthwhileness of my doing so. And ordinarily I would disagree with that viewpoint, because this is something that for some perverse reason I find entertaining. But at this particular moment, although my exact reasoning would probably differ from yours, I am in full agreement with questioning the wisdom of goofing around with this old computer crap. Because everything went well up until a point. And that point came when I tried to loosen the screws holding the heatsink retention bracket to this motherboard. Two of them came out easily. One of them came out with a little persuasion, and one of them refused to come out of place at all. I tried increasing methods of violence to get it out of there. First I tried pressing down on the screwdriver firmly. Then I took my computer-approved service hammer, and ordinarily if you're using one of these in the course of the computer repair, you're actually doing something wrong. But I tried placing the screwdriver on top of the screw that was being so stubborn about coming out of there, and I gave it a few gentle taps with the hammer, at great risk of probably screwing up the motherboard any worse than it might already be screwed up. And that did nothing. So I ultimately resorted to a very difficult method, in that I really could have fallen and hurt myself somewhat badly while doing this. And as a rule, I have an aversion to hurting myself badly. So if it's going to happen, I'd rather it happen for a good reason than a stupid one, especially when it comes to explaining things to any emergency room personnel or physicians or other healthcare professionals that might be involved. Here's what I did to do it. I took the whole case and I set it down on the ground. I put the screwdriver on top of the recalcitrant screw, which by now was just a couple of turns away from being completely rounded off. And then I took my knee and I put as much of the weight of my body as I could manage without falling over or slipping into the computer or gouging the motherboard or engaging in some no doubt equally entertaining disaster. And I put all the weight I could manage into that thing, and I gave it a turn. And finally, that stupid screw took the hint, and it came off of the motherboard. But wow, what a stinking ordeal. Let's see what we've got here. It looks like this motherboard has unfortunately taken some damage around the area of the VGA port. I'll give you a hint, it's not supposed to be floppy like that. And more importantly than that, it's not supposed to protrude so noticeably from the rest of the ports on the motherboard. So I'm guessing that something truly unfortunate happened to this system along the way, and it probably explains why someone chose to fit this aftermarket video card to it. It's just a low-end PCI job. I have no idea what chipset's actually on it. It identifies itself as a Jeton 82118 PCI, claims to have 32 megabytes of installed video memory, so you know that it's really nothing to write home about. These machines have a surprisingly sturdy case for their price, but I almost end up wishing at times that Dell had chosen to maybe cheapen the case just a little bit in exchange for populating this set of solder pads with an actual AGP socket on this motherboard. Would have been a nice touch, but I guess it just didn't ultimately fit on the bill of materials. So although these are otherwise very nice machines, they're painfully limited in what you can do in terms of video expansion, and I imagine that someone chose this particular aftermarket card just because it was cheap, as opposed to actually being capable. Because I want to see, because I have such a sense of adventure, I will try hooking up a monitor to the onboard VGA connector and see if it actually still happens to work. And I'm not just doing that for the sake of adventure, I'm also doing it because this card has a problem. You can see there's a moderately bloated capacitor there. You can also see this fun little cooling fan, which has a product name that is undoubtedly inspired by English around the world. It says, "You lucky." So cool. Well, at first I thought maybe that was simply lousy use of the English language, poor grammar from a non-native speaker. But when I turned the fan, I came to realize that maybe the name on the fan was intended to be descriptive, and that you would be very lucky if anything attached to this fan managed to stay. So cool. But I did finally get the I/O shield on this machine straightened out. It's not quite perfect, but it's never going to be. It's had just a little too much damage there at the bottom. I don't know if somebody tripped over the cable that was attached to a monitor, in which case they probably soon had a monitor on their foot, which undoubtedly felt just as good as ripping the connector out of the motherboard would have and being tripped. But it doesn't really matter. I'm going to go ahead and throw the motherboard back in, complete with all the screws, including 2 of them that are rather abused. And finally, we'll get to see if this thing actually powers up. I know, it's a sickness. I should have just sent it to the recycler by now. In the course of putting this machine back together, I ran into another little snag that I'm sure some of you in the viewing audience happened to see coming from a mile away, but eternal optimist that I am, I sure didn't. When I went to put the motherboard back in the case and screw it down, I discovered that the VGA port, which was previously noted had been pushed out considerably from the rest of the ports on the motherboard by some kind of an unknown injury, was once again doing a number on the positioning of the I/O shield. And I was in no mood to put up with those shenanigans, so I came up with a certifiably perfect and no doubt computer manufacturer approved way to fix this. I set the motherboard on its end, and I gently tapped that port back in line with the others with a hammer. And you should pay attention to me when I say that that is a certifiably computer manufacturer approved method for repairing such a disaster, because I am positively certifiable. Alright, let's go ahead and cable this thing up and see what happens. In recent times, I have had a couple of power supplies that have decided to do their best impression of a shotgun when I applied power to them for the first time. And given that that's an outcome that I generally do not prefer, I'm hedging my bets here with this switched outlet strip, just on the off chance that this power supply decides to do the same. And hopefully it won't take anything like my lovely keyboard with it. I should probably be using a crappy rubber dome job that I don't actually care about, but hey, you only live once, so here we go, smoke test! Well, it powered up, but my monitor's not on. I'll fix that, provided it works, which it seems to. Oh, it didn't stay turned on. I thought it was going to, but apparently it was just doing the little power on initialization routine. Oh my gosh. I don't believe it. The onboard video actually works. After all it's been through, being nearly ripped off the board and precisely replaced with the action of a computer-grade data hammer, it still works. So what have we got here? It's kind of washed out in the sunlight. We have an Intel Pentium 4 at 2.53 gigahertz. You know, it's that extra 0.03 that makes a big difference. 512 kilobytes, so probably a Northwood. I don't think any Prescotts are supported by the Dimension 2400, much less any 800 megahertz front-side bus processors. A BIOS that I think is 2 revisions out of date, and the time and date on the system, the time's wrong, but the date's still correct. That's just absolutely amazing. Wow. So this thing might actually be worth keeping around and doing something entertaining with. Alright, time to get the other one over here and see what it does. Here's contestant number 2 on uxwbill's Hamfest Computer Bingo. Contestant number 2 hails from the land of Antec cases and PC Cheaps motherboards, has a 30 gigabyte hard drive, an NVIDIA GeForce FX 5500 video card, Linux Mint 17, and a Samsung DVD RW CD writer combo drive. Without further ado, smoke test! I must say I was pleasantly surprised to see that this power supply is actually honestly rated. I had figured it would be approximately 250 watts in size, and I was exactly right. So let's go ahead and power this thing on and see what it does. Actually does seem to work. The CPU fan's running, the power supply fan is running. This Antec fan is not running. We do have a power on self-test. And hopefully I told it to go into setup. Oh yeah, we are in the setup program here. Go ahead and just take a quick look at things here and see if they seem to be sane. The time is certainly a lot closer to being right. Well, it's a couple hours fast, but it's closer than the other one was, that's for darn sure. Go ahead and see what's going on in here as far as the boot order goes. Looks like it's set to boot up from the hard drive first. Yeah, smart disabled for the hard drives. Well, some people say it's not worth much, but any extra bit of warning you can get is certainly always recommended. So go ahead and turn that back on. Linux is an ACPI aware OS, so we shouldn't have problems with that. At least by the time of Linux Mint 17 it certainly should be. And PCI IDE Busmaster should definitely be turned on. We do not need to allocate an IRQ to the PCI VGA. Most software does not require that. Okay, serials enabled, onboard floppy, parallel ports in standard mode. I usually set them to ECP just because you never know what you might be using one for if you're still of a mindset to use parallel ports. Audio's enabled, modem's enabled. This motherboard doesn't have an onboard modem, and I'm getting a mosquito bite right now. Ethernet, USB for DOS, thumb drive for DOS is turned off. CPU plug and play, so this board could be overclocked if you wanted to. A hardware monitor. See what's going on with our various fans and things there. Power supply voltages look pretty close. 3.3 is a little low, but that's to be expected in a lightly loaded system such as this. Although I would be of the opinion that a 250 watt power supply is a little on the light side for this. Alright, well before we go ahead and pop out of the setup program here, I do hear a rumbling fan. I think it's probably on the video card. Yep, the video card fan is definitely a little rumbly, and no sign of life from this Antec thing, which would be well explained by the fact that it's not actually plugged into anything. So that's a good feature to have, isn't it? Everything that you have seen in this video so far was recorded around the end of September, early October, somewhere in there. It's now February 3rd, 2015, and I think it might just be time to finally wrap up this video and finish up with everything that I had to talk about throughout its rather multifaceted nature. And I'll try and make this quick, but if you've been able to bear with me so far, I'm sure you will make it through the end of this video, because believe me, the end is not too far away. First and foremost, our general contractors for both guttering and bathroom rebuilding, well, nothing has been seen or heard from either one of them to my knowledge. And that's a very unfortunate situation, but I'm not directly involved in any of that, so I cannot speak intelligently about what has been going on or what may be going on in the future. It is entirely possible that a new set of general contractors for guttering and bathroom rebuilding will be in our future. However, in all fairness toward the bathroom contractor, it has to be said that up until, probably the months of November, December, somewhere in there was still a lot of decision-making being made about what the new bathroom would entail and how it would be designed. Moving on to the computers, which are probably of much more interest to most of the viewers on this particular channel. This is the self-built gray box, I guess you could say, Linux machine. This PC Chips motherboard, or PC Cheaps such as it might be, despite the source, is actually a pretty nice little board. It would have been nice if I'd have gotten the upgraded version that contained a few extras, such as built-in serial ATA, but for the price I really can't complain. However, there is one thing about this system that is definitely going to change, and that is this power supply. This power supply is probably 250 watts with a very healthy following wind. It's also obvious that it's a very old and cheap design, barely converted to meet the ATX specification of soft power and standby power, because you can see right here cut into the case is actually a space for a second wire to be run. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with what that second wire would be, that's actually intended for a hard power switch that's used in baby AT system applications. So this is a very cheap, very minimally equipped power supply, and I have had it apart. It shows some signs of having been hot in certain areas, hot enough to be distressing, and the heat sinking on the major power components leaves a lot to the imagination. So I'm going to change this power supply out to something that I will feel a lot more comfortable using. Other than that, for the price, this is not a bad little system, and a person could use it for all kinds of things. Even a lot of fairly modern computing applications would run very happily on this, as long as you're not asking it to do anything like rendering high-definition video or anything along those lines. The second computer that was a project, this is the Dell Dimension 2400, and this is what became of it. This is a computer that has been outfitted with Windows 2000 Professional. It is actually running Windows 2000 Professional with a great number of unofficial updates. Now, I'm not going to get into that in the course of this particular video. Windows 2000 and all its unofficial updates might be the subject of a future video, because there is a lot of ground that a person can cover here, especially if that person is inclined to run Windows 2000 here in 2015, or later, if you're watching this video a bit down the road, as a daily driver operating system. The software that you're looking at here, first and foremost, this is Pale Moon's Windows XP build, in a rather unfortunate decision on the part of the Pale Moon developers. The official build of the browser, the mainline build of the browser, has abandoned support for Windows XP. But there is an enthusiast and contributor to the Pale Moon community who is keeping Pale Moon supported in its mainline build on Windows XP for at least the end of support of Windows Server 2003. I'm hoping that someone might pick up the ball and run with it beyond that point, because even though Windows XP is out of support, that doesn't change a very simple fact. A lot of people are using it. Despite this being the XP specific build of Pale Moon, it runs just fine on Windows 2000. I actually have a couple of browser tabs up here that you can see, including YouTube's best channel, as its author describes it, my brother, the Keykeeper. The BBC News homepage with some very saddening news on the front of it. It really makes you wonder what the hell is wrong with those ISIS people. But that's not the point of this video. Microsoft homepage. I'd rather talk about much happier things than that, you know. There's plenty of bad news in the world without my focusing on it. And then the front page of Wikipedia, containing their featured article of the day, and also some news as well. Pale Moon is not the only current browser that will run on Windows 2000 with all of its unofficial updates, though it's my understanding that Google Chrome is more than a little bit sketchy. I have not tried to install it, or rather I tried very briefly, but because Google Chrome does not match up with my interest in computer software, and also because it didn't end up working, I did not try to get Google Chrome working on this system. Some of you will be aware that I set up a computer running Windows 2000 on an AMD Athlon XP microprocessor, so you might ask why I felt the need to do the same with a computer pushing an Intel Pentium 4, and the answer is actually the Pale Moon web browser, because in its official mainline builds, it makes use of hardware-resident, microprocessor-resident instructions that do not exist in the AMD Athlon XP. And again, while there are unofficial builds that strip out the requirement for SSE3 support, I believe it is, those don't seem to be developed in real close lockstep to the official and semi-official Pale Moon builds. So I wasn't crazy about using those, and since I had this computer laying around after having rescued it from the recycling bin at the Hamfest, well, I decided why the heck not? And this system actually could be pretty darn usable with the upgrades that it's had. This is only a Dell Dimension 2400, but it's actually not too bad. Go ahead and punch up a web page here, and you can see that it manages to come up relatively quickly. These JavaScript heavy web pages of today are such a disaster. I have a big old advertisement there at the top because somehow I have not managed to install AdBlock Plus on this particular browser yet. Probably should do that because you can see how that flash ad up at the top with its video is really serving to drag things down. And it doesn't help matters that the Intel 845 integrated graphics on this system cannot really offer much in the way of hardware acceleration that all modern web browsers are making use of. But the actual page itself is pretty usable. You could certainly read this, and with a little bit of diddling around with some add-ons to the browser like AdBlock Plus and FlashBlock, no script if you feel the need to go that far, although I find that too constrictive in the line of what I'm doing, you could certainly make the usability experience a good bit better than it is. This is a different browser. This is actually a Firefox nightly build, probably not the latest nightly build as of this writing. I haven't tried to download that. It's 38.0 Alpha 1 from 2015, January 17th. So new enough to prove the point at least. Mozilla does not really organize their nightly builds too well if you get to them through their FTP site. So it's a little hard to know what the most current nightly is if you go through that way of doing things, which I usually do because when you're running on an unsupported operating system such as this, the Mozilla website will lie to you. It will tell you your platform is not supported. Well, I wonder what they'd think of this. Because I do have quality feedback turned on, so I'm sure that if it's sent, any reports to them, that it probably has alerted someone to the fact at Mozilla that I am running this on Windows 2000. There again is the version information for the browser. Speaking of the integrated graphics in this system, you can see that despite the serious indignity that the onboard graphics port suffered, it's actually working very nicely. You can navigate the Dell website here, go to support by product, just kind of goofing around and killing time. And this has already run to 10 minutes. I'm sure this video is well over an hour long by this point. If I had the service tag for this machine, I would look it up, but I don't, so I won't. So we'll just browse all products and work our way down to the Dimension 2400 series machine. Not bad for such a budget machine. The only upgrades that I have given this, apart from replacing the seriously faulty topmost optical drive, the bottom one is still touchy, but it works. The floppy drive, I started messing around with it. I really don't know where I left that. I had to put a hard drive in this machine. As you can probably hear, it's got one of those Western Digital screamers in it. I think it's a 20 gigabyte drive. I might be doing something with that in the future, because here's something that Weasel2HTM was kind enough to send me a long time ago. There might be a little snippet video about that. A much quieter, much larger hard drive. Should work well in this system because the Dimension 2400 with its latest BIOS revision, in addition to supporting more than the amount of RAM that Dell advertised these systems as supporting at 1 gigabyte, it also has 48-bit LBA support. So we'll go ahead and close out the browser there and just take a quick look at some of the hardware aspects. Here's the CPU usage over the last couple of minutes. You can see there are a lot of times it's been pinned to the maximum, but again, this is a 2.53 some odd gigahertz Pentium 4 Northwood. I might see about upgrading this system to a 2.8 gigahertz Northwood with a 533 megahertz front side bus, because I think that represents the most that you can do with this particular system. A look at the installed memory. You can see the physical memory limit there is right at 2 gigabytes, which reflects the actual amount of memory installed in the machine, less whatever the onboard graphics hardware happens to be stealing for its own use. Well, it has come time, I'll get it right eventually. it has come time to wrap up this video. Thank you so much for watching, as always. And if you have a comment, especially if you happen to make it through all of my rambling and pontificating about so many different subjects, well, by all means, feel free to leave a comment if you should happen to have one. Well, I thought you were done with this video, but apparently I was wrong. That's never a good sign, is it? This is the little Heathkit clock that I mentioned picking up during the beginning of this particular video epic. Unfortunately, at some point between then and now, this clock has gone from working passably well to having a lot of major problems. Go ahead and show you what it's doing here. It's been plugged in for several minutes now, and the time's not advancing at all. The reason being that the selection switch between time display and alarm setting on the bottom is presently set to the alarm setting position. If I switch it over to time, well, unfortunately something very definitely goes wrong with this poor clock, which is supposed to be indicating AM and PM since it was built by Heath to be a 12-hour model. Unfortunately, the AM and PM indicators are not showing up, unless, of course, I toggle the switch on the bottom that is responsible for fast time setting. And then the AM indicator shows up, but as you can see, no actual setting takes place. Kind of a shame, really. The slow toggle switch does absolutely nothing. Might be dirty contacts. Hopefully it's just aged passive parts at the worst. But if it's broken, well, I'll have to get the schematic online and see if there's anything I can do to help nurse the poor thing back to health, because it's such a cool clock that I would hate to see it consigned to the scrap bin. I do believe it was manufactured by Heath Corporation as opposed to being a kit, because the label on the bottom of it says Heath as opposed to Heathkit. You can see the model number and the serial number. Go ahead and try to turn those right side right so that you can actually see what it says. There's the Heath Company's Benton Harbor, Michigan address. Designed for 120 or 240 volts AC, though I believe you have to manually set it by changing a jumper inside of it. There are the switches for time and alarm mode, fast and slow setting, and the speaker for the alarm, which I believe to be just a simple tone. Surprisingly meaty speaker, probably just by virtue of the fact that it was a readily available off-the-shelf component. The alarm on and off switch, and the snooze switch. So this will probably have a video dedicated to it. And now, folks, you have truly reached the point where you're done with this video, and if you have a comment even after all of that, you can certainly feel free to leave it. Thank you so much for watching.